This morning, we will be starting with the second keynote address session. And we are very privileged to have our third keynote speaker from Australia, Associate Professor Dr. Jake Lynch.
Our keynote speaker, Dr. Lynch, is the Director of Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. He is also an executive member of the Sydney Peace Foundation and Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. He is also a Senior Research Fellow of the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg.
Dr. Lynch has spent the past 15 years researching, developing, teaching, and training in peace journalism. Since 1999, he has also led training workshops in peace journalism for professional editors and reporters, and in media skills for peace workers in many countries, for example, Fiji, Indonesia, the Philippines, Lebanon, Jordan, and the UK. His publications include several books, many book chapters, and refereed articles on peace and peace journalism.
His research interests include peace journalism, peace studies, and media analysis. Among many other awards and honors, in 2010, Dr. Lynch was elected Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. And in 2012, he was appointed Senior Research Fellow, School of Communication, University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Jake Lynch.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that generous introduction. Thank you to the organisers of this splendid event. The sessions I've attended up to now have given me the opportunity to do a great deal of learning about the situation here and have prompted a great many thoughts and ideas about the positive potential for enhancing the ability to make non-violent responses to conflict in symbolic domains, including, of course, in journalism. Is my display? It is. Good. So, what I plan to do is to share some brief reflections about peace journalism, what it is and where it came from. I will explore some recent research findings which I am going to suggest support the idea that adjusting the ways in which conflicts are reported can influence the meanings people make in response and thereby alter the symbolic environment to make it more receptive and more conducive to proposals for effective non-violent responses to conflict. And I will attempt in the closing portion of my speech to relate that back to the situation here in the deep south of Thailand. I'm gratified that I have the honour of being part of, I suppose, what I hope will be a growing stream of international links between people in this region who are working for peace and your colleagues and counterparts in many other countries. Indeed, last night with the entertainment, I noticed that there's a very interesting regional twinning initiative already underway because we were enjoying music from the deep south of the United States here in the deep south of Thailand. So that was very interesting. So first let me reflect a little on peace journalism, what it is and where it came from. Peace journalism has been called the policy response or the policy prescription in response to a landmark study in communication called The Structure of Foreign News. This appeared in 1965 and it was co-authored by Marihon Baruga and Johan Galtung. And Johan Galtung will be known to many of you as one of the chief ideas givers in the field of peace research. And Galtung and Ruger added another layer to the model that was already in vogue in communication studies, for conceptualizing the relationship between journalism and the world it meets on a daily or weekly basis. Because by then, researchers were already familiar with the concept of the journalist as gatekeeper. The journalist has the job of reporting the facts, but of course the facts are much bigger than the reports. So some means has to be found for winnowing them down. And Galtung and Ruger showed that this was not a random process. It was instead structured, as in the structure of foreign news. So the bits that got let through the gate were always or usually the same bits, and therefore the bits that got left out were also usually the same bits. And they proposed a number of screens or tuning factors, as they were called, to explain their findings, where the news values that arise out of the economic structure of the news industry predicate a certain form of journalistic response, in particular to issues of conflict. And one of them is a threshold, that is to say, something which affects a large number of people is newsworthy. Of course, threshold is to some extent in the eye of the beholder. One can imagine an incident of similar magnitude taking place in different parts of the world and being treated differently by different media. Another one, which has particular relevance, I think, to the way in which journalism shapes our perceptions of conflict, is frequency. Now, because journalists work between deadlines, there was a premium, Galtung and Ruger proposed, on reporting segments or sections of events in a conflict which lent themselves to that interval. That is to say, a thing which began, was conducted and finished all in the space between editions was likely to be reported. And the example they chose, and hence this is why the picture's there, the example they chose was a soldier being shot, falling and dying on the battlefield. The picture shows an interview being conducted with American troops in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a so-called embedded journalist. So when the embedding of journalists took place by the United States military in that conflict, it was, in a sense, the logical upshot of this convention or this tuning factor of frequency. But of course the problem is what that excludes. If the concentration is on events which have that frequency, then what about the processes which may take a lot longer in their increments? So the differences that arise out of them may take a lot longer to accrue, but they are nevertheless underway all the time. And the processes may be addressing the reasons for this conflict, the reasons why it resulted in a battle. They may indeed have to do with the process by which some people in parties to conflict have an interest in shaping our understanding of it such that it results in hostilities. So all those processes which you might think are essential to understand the underlying dynamics of a conflict are at a premium in news reporting for those reasons. So that was frequency. Negativity was another one. I'm afraid that bad news is always better than good news. And in a sense, that is necessary. We should be told when things go wrong. If we have a situation where things go wrong and we are not told about it, then the lookout for freedom of information would be grave indeed. But perhaps what that misses out is that whenever things go wrong, there are people who are trying to put them right. There are people who are trying to devise solutions or alternatives or ameliorative measures to enable us to carry on with our daily lives. And for those people to be missed out of the equation may also, you might think, distort the impression that readers and audiences receive. So equipped with this schema, Johan Galtung came up with this idea of peace journalism, and he came to a Taplow Court, which is a stately home in England, which is the cultural centre of an international Buddhist organisation, and he ran a summer school in peace journalism. And he came up with this schema, the peace journalism model. And the peace journalism model is intended to remedy the shortcomings bequeathed by the ongoing application of the structure of foreign news. And the event, this summer school, I was chairing it, afforded me an early glimpse of some of the difficulties that were to follow in introducing this idea to professional journalists. Because one of my roles was to invite along some of my journalistic colleagues of the time to take part. And I was unwise enough to invite my newly appointed boss, the managing editor of Sky News, where I worked at the time as a political correspondent. And he gave a presentation which was not entirely on point, to be honest. And Galtung was listening very eagerly. At the end, he jumped in and he said, "What you say is very interesting," he said. "But what is more interesting is what you do not say." And at this, my heart began to sink somewhat. And here's my boss sitting here, especially when a little bit later, in a heated debate, Galtung told him he was talking bullshit. He said, "You are talking bullshit," he said. So at that, I could visualize my reporting career sprouting wings and flying out the window. But luckily, it didn't happen in quite that way. But anyway, that was an indication that the attempt to bring peace to bear on journalism and vice versa could sometimes generate as much heat as light. Now, what that event gave rise to was a whole area of activity, briefly referred to by the presenters earlier, which was journalist training courses. And journalist training courses were devised as an intervention in conflict and financed by a whole list of aid agencies, both official and in the NGO sector, and that activity continues to this day. And what prompted them really was a feeling, I think, among many people that journalism is an influential field of endeavour and its influence should be shaped in such a way as to be constructive in the context of conflict. And a lot of people have that feeling and continue to do so to this day, and that's really why that activity took off. But to go briefly through these domains, the first observation to make, therefore, off the back of the structure of foreign news, is that because of the tuning factor of frequency, news generally is biased in favour of event over process. That is, it's biased in favour of violence over conflict. And they're by no means the same thing, as people will know. So the first remedial step was to find ways to put that part of the picture back in, to focus on the conflict issues. What is the conflict about? If there is violence, what is leading people to join the violence, to become violent? How are people being mobilized to give their consent or their approval to violence? These kinds of issues. So ways to put those back in. The second one was that journalism in general would follow the agendas set by people who already had a lot of power. The reproduction of press releases from government departments and so forth. And one could describe that as being propaganda orientated. So to that, Galtung counterposed a truth orientation. A truth orientation. That's, I can feel the hackles of my academic colleagues rising at the notion of a truth orientation. And likewise, they may rise at the proposition that journalism's job is to report facts. So I'll say a little bit about facts and how they can be reconceptualized to fit in with those interests a little bit later. But that was the second of the domains. The third one, very important, is that war journalism, as he put it, the dominant form, was elite-orientated, whereas peace journalism was people-orientated. People-orientated. Quite often in a conflict, leaders, who are journalists' usual sources, are reluctant to start talking about peace. And that is often for understandable reasons. They may feel chary of being seen to go out on a limb because they may risk having that limb cut off behind them. But at the same time, stirrings of peace may be taking place at lower levels in society. And what's at stake, therefore, is whether journalism or other fields of symbolic production lend visibility to those efforts. Does journalism illuminate them or keep them in the dark? That's perhaps the choice at stake. And that category of people as peacemakers, who can either be ignored and disempowered or given attention and perhaps empowered and valorized by such a field as journalism, is a very important dividing line between war journalism and peace journalism. And lastly, of course, war journalism is victory orientated. Western journalism, I think, largely decided that with the killing in a ditch of Colonel Gaddafi 3 years ago, NATO had won, and there was no more need to pay any attention to what was going on in Libya. There are still a few journalists giving us a steady trickle of news, and it casts, I would say, a very problematical light, to say the least, on the notion that you can use force to knock over a distasteful regime and thereby improve the situation and the human security for people in that country. But that is very much in a minor key, and I always feel that we're in danger of losing the lesson from Libya and its applicability elsewhere because it is so marginalized. Whereas peace journalism is hopefully orientated towards people who are going to try to solve the problem, or if not solve, if that's too big an ask, if that's too high a hurdle, then perhaps transform it into a phase more conducive to non-violent responses. So by way of illustration, here's the incipient divide between them, aptly illustrated by these two front covers of English language media from that same period I referred to, the build-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The first one is the cover of Newsweek, and by posing the question, who will win, of course the other way to pose the same question is, who will lose? And how often do reports of conflict give us that paradigm? On the one hand, on the other hand, and as I learned when I was a reporter at the BBC, if you're in television news, you have to say, in the end, only time will tell. And every story can be boiled down to that formula. But the unfortunate thing is that, yes, you've heard both sides, therefore. The unfortunate thing is that every movement in a conflict, every development in a conflict, begs to be assessed for how it is leading either one side or the other closer to victory or closer to defeat. It may contribute to a framework of understanding the conflict where the parties perceive that they are headed for only one of either two alternatives, winning or losing. So the only way they have to avoid defeat is to try harder to win or step up their efforts for victory. Now, the other one, the Daily Mirror, is from the same time, and it is a British tabloid, for better or worse, which at that time perceived the potential in filling a niche to be the anti-war voice, the popular anti-war voice, and it suggests in its own inimitable way that there may be a little bit more to it. And the question of why these people want to either win or lose may be something which we should pay more attention to. And maybe, in doing so, we could figure out a way to enable them to get what they want without having to come to blows. So it finishes by saying, "I'm a coming to get you, Saddam." And as a little memory for you of the days of President George W. Bush, you know, when President Obama entered the White House, the intelligence quotient went up, but I'm afraid the comedy quotient went down. So we have to live with that. But there we are. That's the incipient divergence between the two forms. But if you're, as it were, trapped in this way of understanding the conflict, where you're either winning or losing all the time, then if you are going to try to escalate or step up your efforts for victory, you may have to justify it. And in justifying it to your colleagues, to your public, to the community at large, what you may do, therefore, is you may start to characterize the other as not merely the one on the other side, but one who is beyond the pale of civilized treatment, one who is so bad as to justify the escalation to these more extreme measures against them. And that's where war journalism tends to build up its own world picture, divided, as you see, into good and evil. And even some cases, the labels switch dizzyingly in rapid succession. So the Democratic Republic of Evil, formerly good, maybe that does fit Libya. You know, in the era of the new Labour government in the UK, the issues of the Lockerbie bombing were resolved, diplomacy was resumed, and it was all very welcoming to Colonel Gaddafi, even to the point where the Gaddafi regime sponsored part of the London School of Economics which ended in scandal. So that was perhaps not a very good idea at the time, but the atmosphere had switched. But then, of course, the atmosphere then switched rapidly again. So Gaddafi, having been evil, was then good and then evil again. And that framework, that way to conceive of the conflict, arguably contributed to its escalation. And certainly during the time when the British, the Americans and the French were taking a lead in putting pressure on the Gaddafi regime and preparing to launch military action, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, was not short of advice, including from the press. And he could pick up one of several newspapers in London at that time and read that if Colonel Gaddafi remains in office by a certain point in time, then David Cameron will have failed, it said. So you can imagine if there is any effect of the media on the policy-making environment, if it becomes a factor, then if it's taken into account, it is likely to lead to escalation rather than seeking to calm the situation down. So that's some of the consequences of war journalism, and it manifests itself, I think, in a lot of what journalists think of as objective reporting. Objective reporting. So hearing both sides is obviously a preferable alternative to hearing just one side, but it may have the effect of escalating the conflict. If there's a bias in favour of event over process, because the event, the what, the where, and the when is less controversial than the why or the how. And so therefore it feels more objective to stick to those aspects. And the other one is the bias in favour of official sources, because if, for example, The Nation decided to have a lead front page story based on a speech given by a professor at the Prince of Songkla University, then it would immediately attract the complaint, well, why this professor and not that one? Whereas if it decides to have its lead story based on a speech by a government minister, then there is only one minister responsible for that portfolio, so it appears less controversial. So these are conventions which journalists regard as those of objective journalism, but they may also reproduce this war journalism agenda. So peace journalism became a thing. It was an activity, a movement, if you like, a reform, a wave of reform which was being furthered within mediascapes all over the world. And two Asian researchers, Xiao Ting Li and Chris Maslow, one from Singapore, one from the Philippines, published an early research paper on peace journalism in 2005, which opened with the observation, peace journalism made a leap from theory to practice without the benefit of research. So these training courses, these articles that have been appearing, people taking up the cause of peace journalism, had all been doing so without anything being established through research about whether it was feasible or what its effects might be. And therefore, the peace journalism research agenda began to take shape. And one of the questions was, does peace journalism actually exist? And Lee and Maslow were addressing that question. They looked at the conflict coverage of 6 newspapers from different countries across Asia, and they took the peace journalism model and turned it into evaluative criteria for content analysis. And they found that there was quite a bit of peace journalism in some newspapers, for example, the Philippines Daily Inquirer. The second question was whether if there was more peace journalism, it would make any difference. Would it prompt or enable its audiences to give more of a hearing or attach more credence to non-violent responses to conflict? And that remained to be tested. And in a few moments I'll share with you some of my own attempts through my research to do just that. And the third question was, could it be actually carried out? If journalists were convinced of the case for doing more peace journalism, could they actually do it? Or would they be so constrained by the structures within which they work that it would be impracticable? So here are some of the sites where peace journalism was taking place around the world. The top picture shows a trainee journalist in Indonesia on a peace journalism field trip. The middle one is of a group of journalists in Mindanao in the southern Philippines who had had a journalism workshop and field trip. And the lower picture there is Vanessa Bassel, I might say more about her presently, who started the Media Association for Peace in Lebanon. So there's lots of places where peace journalism was taking off. In the UK, we had this conversation with colleagues, not by calling it peace journalism, because of the awkward response that might prompt, but by calling it reporting the world instead. But it was the same kinds of issues. And therefore, having gone that far with these kinds of reform activities, we, that is to say my partner Annabelle McGoldrick and I, took on a study which set out to try to not only gauge the extent of peace journalism taking place, but also try to assess the comparative effects that would be experienced by audiences if exposed to war journalism and peace journalism respectively. So we adopted or adapted the Galtung model into these evaluative criteria for content analysis to figure out how much peace journalism is going on at the moment. And it's things like, does the journalism explore backgrounds and contexts of conflict, or does it just give the surface narrative of events? Does it give the views of all rival parties? Does it have creative ideas for peacemaking? And they may, indeed, often come from layers and levels below the elite, and that shouldn't put us off, in my view. Does it expose lies and cover-up attempts on all sides, not just one side, and does it pay attention to post-war developments? So we had these criteria for figuring out how much peace journalism is underway. The answer is always some. There's always some peace journalism underway if you analyse the content of any media, but hopefully there could be some more. Now, that kind of exercise can only tell you, of course, about the manifest content. The manifest content, that is the bit on the page. If I read a copy of a newspaper and any of you read a copy of the newspaper, that bit of content would be the same. That's the content in front of us on the page. What it can't tell you is the implicit content. I and any one of you might make very different meanings out of that and supply a portion of the content, perhaps even most of the content, by slotting it in to the meaning structures that we already have, that we have learned over time. Okay? So the next frontier, therefore, in this effort to develop a research agenda for peace journalism was this project called A Global Standard for Reporting Conflict. So what we did was we figured out how much peace journalism there is in a sample of media from each of 4 different countries, and we used that as a guide to coding a peace journalism version of each of several familiar stories from television news. And we had the evaluative criteria that I've just put up as a set of headings, and we adjusted the detail underneath those headings to catch the distinctions in the stories we were looking at. And we produced, therefore, 2 bulletins. We had a war journalism bulletin and a peace journalism bulletin, and we showed those to different audiences. And we used a variety of means to garner their responses to try to show what difference peace journalism can make. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you 1 or 2 of the versions we came up with. And the first one is from the study in Australia. We carried out this study in Australia, the Philippines, South Africa and Mexico. Now, in Australia, one of the hardy perennials of the news agenda is political responses to asylum seekers. And quite often that leads to some very punitive responses. So asylum seekers are locked up for months or years on end without their applications being processed. They sustain measurable psychological damage. They have their lives and prospects blighted. They emerge with mental illnesses if they ever do, and a lot of them self-harm. So it's a highly violent response which leads to a lot of other violence. And we wanted to adjust the content slightly to see if that would make a difference to the responses of the viewers. And one very striking factor about coverage of this issue in Australian media is that asylum seekers themselves hardly ever get the chance to speak in their own right. So the difference we made was we went out and found a refugee who had been an asylum seeker and arrived in Australia by boat, and we took his interview and we inserted it into this particular piece of reporting. So this is what we came up with.
The Greens say there's an urgent need to speed up the processing of asylum claims, and the Immigration Department is right to request the transfer of staff from across the government bureaucracy.
There is a real need to have more resources allocated to the Immigration Department to get through the processing of people's claims.
The coalition's obtained a letter from the head of immigration asking to borrow employees from the Agriculture Department. Andrew Metcalf says with more asylum seekers arriving, the department is approaching the point where we will not be able to meet this demand from existing internal staff.
In the last 4 months, the number of people who have been staying in detention for more than 3 months has increased by a shocking 250%.
Labor concedes there are significant pressures.
Part of that is that we're trying to process people more quickly, and that requires more staff. Part of it is that we are rejecting more applications for asylum.
But of the more than 7,000 arrivals over the past 2 years, only about 250 have been or will be sent back where they came from. Most are found to be fleeing a genuine fear of persecution in their country of origin.
If I brought you back, you're kidding me.
Ali Jafari arrived on Christmas Island last November after spending a week on a boat from Indonesia. Now living in Western Sydney, he says he had to flee the Taliban and paid people smugglers over $7,000 for the journey.
Well, I was working for international community in my country, and the situation for me was quite worse because I was Hazara and I was Shia, and I was supporting government and United Nations and Western countries in my country.
So you couldn't get to a United Nations office in Afghanistan?
No, in Afghanistan we didn't have chance.
Demonstrators in Sydney in favour of welcoming asylum seekers are in a majority, according to opinion polls, even though most Australians also say they're against accepting arrivals by boat.
Australians generally are supportive, 52% support asylum seekers actually coming to Australia as immigrants.
Ali Jafari says he wants to be a valued member of Australian society.
I want to prove that Australia did not make a mistake by giving me a permanent residency in here. I would like Australia to be proud of me.
Ali also wants Australians to accept that most boat people are fleeing real danger. Oscar Sabakti, World News Tonight.
So, sorry about the technical glitch, but I think you get the point. The point is that by having the voice of the asylum seeker themselves, that is, in a sense, a success story, because this guy has successfully obtained asylum in Australia and has now successfully settled in Sydney as a refugee. So he is there, if you like, to kind of indicate to the audience that there's nothing to worry about there. Equally, the story to begin with was about the government struggling to cope with the increase in the numbers of asylum seekers, but quite visibly, you know, this guy is coping, and therefore, in effect, it makes a difference to people's responses, because what we found is that the problem was now being defined not as the asylum seekers themselves. The problem was now being defined as the problems in the system, which was struggling to cope and struggling to therefore supply a fair and just outcome to the claims made by people like this chap. But you can imagine if that voice is absent, then what are people left with? People are left only with the voices of politicians, and what we found was they tended to internalise the political conflict. They tended to respond along the lines of their own particular political preference for either one side of politics or the other. So that was part of a pattern. We had this chap in the picture here is a guy from the Mexico study who plays a similar role to the asylum seeker there, and these stories had strong effects In the peace journalism versions, people were less likely to feel hopeless and despairing and resentful, and in the war journalism versions they were more hopeless. There was an anger. There was lots of anger around when people were played television news treatments of contested issues, as you can imagine. But in the peace journalism versions, it was, if you like, a righteous anger. The anger was turned towards the iniquities of a system which were denying justice to people. So that kind of difference that we managed to pick up, so we had in each of the successful versions, the versions that had the strongest effects, there was a dramatic story of an individual, whether it was the refugee in this case, this guy who had been diverted away from a drugs cartel in Mexico, or somebody to carry an idea which had previously been marginalized in the kind of public arena, the public discourse. So people were more receptive to the idea, for example, that the war on drugs in Mexico should be met with constructive, programmatic responses rather than giving the police more weapons. People were more likely to be receptive in the Philippines to the idea of peace talks in respect of the conflict with a bunch of communist guerrillas, the New People's Army, rather than the viewers of the war journalism, who again were more likely to be in favour of giving the army bigger and better weapons to go and attack them. So these were the kind of differences we picked up by making that decision to take an individual whose story could be told, who was the carrier of a kind of subjugated narrative and who was in a position to win attention for it and bring it back into the picture. So we felt that was a significant contribution to the evidence that peace journalism can make a difference, that this obviously study was limited by the fact that people were just sitting down and watching one version of each of several stories, but we can imagine that extended immersion in or exposure to peace journalism would potentially have that transformative effect on the symbolic environment and its receptiveness to proposals for non-violent responses to conflict. So the next question after this was that if it can be shown that peace journalism can make a difference, how can peace journalism be spread and promoted? Well, in some places it's already being spread and promoted, and in the Philippines there's one of the biggest success stories, which is Mindanews. And Mindanews was a response to a situation by a bunch of journalists. Let me just outline the situation for you. Here is a mediascape in which most national media resources are concentrated in a capital city. In a region far to the south of the capital city, people feel it's very difficult to get those media to give an accurate, balanced picture of their lives. So what they do is they leave one of those media and start their own media instead. In other words, it's a story which took place in the Philippines but could equally take place here. That the industry of journalists, stringers, for example, who contribute from here in the Deep South to the Bangkok media, could instead develop their own media with peace journalism. And the way they did it with Mindanews, they got AusAid funding, and they went round to the community and they sought out groups and individuals who felt underrepresented and marginalised in the media as they already existed, and they consulted them about what kind of media they wanted. And so they built up Mindanews as a news website and now acts as a news agency in a consultative fashion using peace journalism. So now it's there as a provider of a thoughtful, considered response to developments in important running stories such as the peace processes with the various armed groups. So that's an important resource. Vanessa Bassel, the lower picture, started the Media Association for Peace in Lebanon. She, in her own career, started by writing for agencies such as the UNDP in her country, but then extended that into contributing to Lebanese newspapers and establishing a sort of steady stream of peace journalism inputs into what was a very war journalistic milieu. Now, I've been talking about journalism and what I see as its potential for intervening in the symbolic environment of a conflict. But of course, as we heard from some of our speakers yesterday, journalism is only one part of a much more broadly defined mediascape. And the conduct and content of journalism is having to be rethought and, in a sense, renegotiated as social media, alternative media, any other forms of media proliferate around it. We are, as Manuel Castells said, now in an age not merely of mass communication, but also of mass self-communication. Now, one of the signature phenomena of these kinds of mediascapes, as I take it, is WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks had a sort of a shoestring operation in a cellar somewhere in Scandinavia. But it devised a very interesting and technologically advanced means for whistleblowers from deep within organizations to supply material, to put material into the public domain without that being traced back to them. That was WikiLeaks' boast. Now, of course, a couple of well-known individuals have found out that it wasn't quite as foolproof as all that, unfortunately. But nevertheless, it was a very important innovation. And there's a lot of material that we now know, which is very important, thanks to WikiLeaks, from the diplomatic cables, for example. To take a recent case, the attack by Israel on the Gaza Strip, with demands for the siege of Gaza to be lifted. That's going on at the moment. And, of course, Israel routinely justifies that siege as a security measure, but it acquires a somewhat different complexion, I think, in light of one of the WikiLeaks disclosures, which was a diplomatic cable according to which officials at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv were told by their Israeli counterparts that the true purpose of the siege was to keep the economy of Gaza on the brink of collapse. Now, arguably, that makes it a collective punishment and therefore a war crime, which you might think add to the case for it to be lifted. So that was an important achievement by WikiLeaks, and one of many. It illustrates perhaps what is sometimes called the democratic affordances opened up by the availability of such media. And again, it's a challenge to journalism to negotiate its conduct and content in implicit partnership with such developments, or in some cases explicit partnership. And that, I think, is an indication as good as any of the continuing importance and salience of journalism as such. Because in order to get the most out of the enormous amount of material amassed by WikiLeaks, it had to enter into partnerships with established media. And we may be at that stage now where for political agency to be exerted in response to or on behalf of content that originates in alternative media or social media, sometimes called new media, it has to attain crossover into the world of mainstream media. And it's a challenge and opportunity for journalism to enter into collaborations, and it is doing so in various well-known instances in different parts of the world, and WikiLeaks is a good example of it. The other importance of journalism, I think, can be glimpsed in arguments over climate change. The United Nations is now trying to convene another summit to discuss the urgent problems of climate change. And journalism has to play a role, I think, in holding a line whereby we, that is the world community, can take as a starting point the existence of human-induced climate change, anthropogenic global warming. And as the cartoon suggests, there's lots of vested interests going around trying to convince us that that is not actually settled. If journalism has the job of distinguishing facts from claims, there are sometimes problems where it passes off claims as facts, like Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. But there are equal problems if it allows facts to be downgraded into claims. You know, we have probably all invested in the science of climate change through taxes. So we need to use it as an asset. And the asset has to be a starting point for discussions in what we do about it. We can't afford for vested interests to get us to unravel it and have to go back to square one all over again. So journalism needs to be there, professional journalism needs to be there to distinguish claims from facts. facts might be thought of, if we don't like that nomenclature, as stores of accumulated social labour, crystallised social labour, which we have to use as assets in these debates. What I heard from one of the contributors in a session yesterday was that when peace talks were formalised between the government of Thailand and the separatists here in the Deep South, under the auspices of Kuala Lumpur, that constituted a central terrain. A central terrain, that's a very interesting concept. In that central terrain can be agreed versions of events, which can be the facts on which we can then count. One of the significant ones she was suggesting is that there is no particular attachment to actual territorial independence. Instead, there is a willingness to talk about a high degree of autonomy as a way to meet the long-standing justice concerns of people in this area. And if that becomes part of that central terrain, professional journalism can have the job of reminding us of it and basing representations of the conflict on the contents of it, and that's a very important function. Another contributor had found from readership surveys that readers of corporate-owned newspapers in Thailand regarded the contents as propagandistic and driven by the business interests of the media concerned. And yet they do still buy and read the newspapers. And therefore, it's a kind of little signal, I think, that there are, around the sides of those propagandistic agendas, still enough items of value for people to invest confidence in journalism, and that's a good sign of its continuing importance. So that therefore, if there is that scope, then that allows room for reform. So I'll finish by reflecting briefly on what I take to be a reform agenda for journalism here. And I owe this entirely to the excellent PhD thesis of my friend Dr. Walakamal Chankamal, who is sitting down in the front there, which has not only the merit of being analytically very impressive, but also puts forward a very well-founded set of ideas for a reform agenda. And what I'm going to suggest is that there is scope for engendering a sense among everybody who is involved in representing conflict issues in the Deep South of Thailand, engendering the sense of being part of a wave of reform. That is to say that the change that has to come is one that will supplement the familiar news values as represented in the structure of foreign news. It's not going to be good enough to serve the community here and its interests for the conflict to be represented simply as a series of big bangs. It's not just the events, but also the processes that we need to hear about. And we need people who are involved in symbolic endeavours, such as journalism and others, to be trained and skilled accordingly to represent the conflict and its issues in that way. So we need a peace journalism movement, I think. And we also need resources which can serve as a gathering point for those representational forms. We need perhaps the equivalent of what Sanjana called yesterday. He reminded us of his very important project Ground Views, which is both a response to a developing news agenda and has a very strong analytical content, and I think that's a very important combination. That would be one form in which one of Walakamal's points could be implemented, namely for journalism to form alliances and enter into collaboration with civil society and academics. And that would be a very important innovation. Each news organisation should establish a conflict news desk, which should therefore address issues in that very interestingly named central terrain. And if one of the issues is about the willingness to talk about autonomy rather than territorial independence, then that will need to be fed in to representations of the conflict on a regular basis, because the general drift, the dominant form of war journalism, will tend instead to characterize the positions of the parties as incapable of being reconciled. So that is a very important function that could be carried out. The new frame of practice has to be, I think, cultivated and spread not only through journalism education but also through a whole variety of other measures, including initiatives in media literacy. But I think, to sum up, peace journalism is a reform proposition within journalism. Journalism is now in active negotiation over its role, its conduct and content with many other forms of symbolic production, and rightly so, because that's a creative response to the new mediascapes in which we are now located. There is evidence that adjusting the representation of conflict to include more of the precepts of peace journalism, or to match peace journalism, can make a difference in terms of the meanings that audiences are prompted and enabled to make in response. And those meanings can, over time, build up into a symbolic environment which is more receptive and more conducive to non-violent initiatives and conflict responses. That, I take it, is profoundly in the interests of people here, as it is in other conflict-affected societies, which is a very broad category, and so therefore circumstances, I believe, are set fair now for a peace journalism reform movement to be instantiated and spread here in the deep south of Thailand. With that thought, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lynch.